this webinar series came out of the grief groups that Allison Tischler and I started for those of us who are in the metastatic breast cancer community to really have a place to process our grief, to process the experience that's often very difficult of living with a terminal illness, something that will eventually kill us. And we've talked a lot about end-of-life stuff. We've talked about anticipatory grief. We've talked about making choices at the end of life. We've talked about estate planning. And I got to thinking, it's all well and good to be talking about those things. And I still think it's very important for us to be thinking about what we want towards the end of life, but we're not there yet. As many of us in the metastatic community talk about, we say we're not dead yet, or not today. And we are living today, and we are trying to figure out how to live with the, I like to call it, as Dexter calls it, his dark passenger, right? There's this thing that's always in the back of our mind that is what has changed us because of this experience. And for me, I know that experiencing the betrayal of my body has been such a huge thing. I always used to be able to jump out of bed to do whatever I needed to do, and my body was there along for the ride. And I think I kind of just forgot and took for granted that I could walk, or I could run, or I could get out of bed. But then when cancer and the various metastases begin to affect our ability to move, it becomes something that is just so front and center. And what I've experienced with yoga is that by learning a practice that helps to unify, as Susanna talks about in her book, my mind, my body, and really ground myself to the earth, that has changed the way that I experience metastatic breast cancer. And so that's why I asked Susanna to come on today and talk to us about her yoga practice, and particularly some of the wonderful things in her book, which is Embrace Yoga's Roots, Courageous Ways to Deepen Your Yoga Practice. And for those of you who don't think that courage is part of what you need to have in order to have a rich yoga practice, you will learn quite a bit today. So before we delve into all of that, I asked Susanna to kick us off by leading us in some, whether it's a meditation or whatever Susanna wants to call it, to really help us to be present here today. So I'm going to turn it over to Susanna, and then we're going to get to know her after she does that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a real honor to be here and to be with an old friend and meet new friends and folks who are listening in. So we'll do a drop-in. I like to think of drop-ins as a way to just kind of come into a collective shared energy. If it's helpful to think of it as a meditation, that's great. If that doesn't work for you, that's great. You can think of it as something else. There's no one way to do this. So maybe you want to lie down. Maybe you want to lean back against a wall or a chair. Maybe you want to have your eyes open and gazing at a spot in front of you. Maybe you want your eyes to be closed. So different choices, and see what feels okay for you in this moment. And I will invite a bell. So this is a bell that I'll invite 3 times, and we can listen to the sound of the bell, and then I'll guide a little bit with my voice. Breathing in, I'm aware that I am breathing in. Breathing out, I'm aware that I am breathing out. In, out. If you would like to do this in this moment, I invite you to scan and notice any part of your body or mind, emotions that feels a sense of ease or sukha. Sukha means ease. And it may be very few places, but perhaps it's in your pinky or an elbow or the corner of the foot. And focus your awareness on that sukha, on that ease. If it feels okay for you, you can see what it might feel like to expand that feeling of ease beyond that area. One of my yoga teachers says, as long as one finger wiggles, it's enough to practice. And even if no fingers wiggle, we can still practice. And so as we sit and breathe, becoming aware of the part of you that is aware. So the part of your consciousness that's aware of you being aware, of your focus on the breath. This part that is described as universal, as pervading in the texts. This part of us is described as not being able to be wedded or burned, not being able to be changed. But the part of us that's eternal. And maybe there's a glimpse of that conscious experience, or what might it be like to be aware of it. You can hold that, and we'll take a few more breaths in silence now. So as you hear the bell, slowly coming back into the shared space. Before we look at the screen, if you're looking, taking a moment to look around you, noticing form and color, not worrying if the laundry needs to be folded or if your room is clean or not. It doesn't matter, but just taking in shape is a way that orienting ourselves in space can feel grounding and supportive. And then we'll come back to this shared circle.
Thank you, Susanna, for guiding us through that. Whenever I talk to people about yoga now, I remind myself that I'm talking to probably people who thought, as I did prior to this experience with cancer, that it seemed pretty hokey and out there, and it wasn't very objective, right? It's all about feelings and things like that. And so if any of you are thinking that way today, I want to make sure that you know that we're including you in this space. This is not just for people who think yoga is amazing. This is also for people who think yoga might be a little hokey, a little out there, and thinking about connecting to energy or the universal energy, or to what is divine, or what is going to live beyond us. That those are all concepts that are hard. They're not easy, and they're not easy to connect to. So I just want to give that, I don't know if that's a disclaimer, or just for everybody here today, that we want to talk to everybody. It's not just the people who are already converts, but to everybody who thinks that yoga might not actually be for them. So Susanna, I'd love for you to talk about your background. How did you come to this practice of yoga, and where are you now in the practice of yoga?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I came to yoga from suffering, right? From an experience of suffering and from an experience of separation. I was born, my father is Indian, my mother is British, and I was born in the 70s at a time when, people just didn't do that in England. There weren't really interracial couples. Um, my family was told, my parents were told, you'll have to adopt because you'll have half breeds. And then when they went ahead and, managed to find someone who would marry them and had children anyway, we were born, my brother and I, into a world that made it very clear that we weren't wanted. And so all of that, even though I was a child, all of that was going on and kind of went inside of me. And then we moved to the United States, which is why I sound like I sound. I don't have a British accent, because we were seeking to get away from some of that discrimination. But we ended up moving to Los Angeles area and to a particular suburb where there continued to be a lot of racial discrimination. So I grew up fighting, and physically fighting on the outside, but a lot of those insults and things went inside. And so I think most people can relate to that feeling for different reasons of not belonging, or feeling not good enough, or feeling not, like you're not truly welcome somewhere. People don't really see the full you, or you don't even know who you fully are. So all of those things were happening for me. And the thing that I went to, or the tools that I went to, not really realizing it at first, where my father would teach me mindfulness or meditation, or lead a guided meditation so I could fall asleep or deal with my anxiety. I was really shy, like painfully shy. Before doing something like a test or things like that. And so initially it was all of that brought me to yoga. And then when I was in college, I was having anxiety attacks. Like, it's just a stressful time, and I couldn't quite figure out what to do, but I knew I had to do something. So I went to a yoga class, and in that class was like just one of those YMCA classes with a wonderful gem of a teacher who didn't make us feel like we were not doing it right if we couldn't do all the poses, and I remember feeling a connection between my mind and my body and my spirit, and knowing, oh, there's something here that is helpful for me. But also I knew, because it's a part of my ancestry and my history, I think it's going to help me with this, like, kind of full circle reconnecting back. So I began that path, and I was also a teacher after that. After college, I became a high school teacher and loved to learn and study. And so just kind of naturally brought back what I was learning about yoga into my classroom and taught students. And then ended up also writing about my experiences with yoga and discrimination and cultural issues, which turned into now, that really, like the book you held up, Abigail, it's like a book about yoga and social justice. I just want to make that clear. So no one's like, oh, I'm going to deepen my yoga practice, without thinking that, yeah, you'll get yoga, but you'll also get a really hugely healthy dose of how can we practice in a way, because the way I understand yoga and how it's been defined to me is it's a pathway of reducing suffering for us, each of us, but also in the world for our communities. And so it's not separate, like me finding ease and peace a little bit, even in difficult circumstances, isn't separate from me supporting and helping other people, supporting other people and finding that as well.
I love how you talk about it being rooted in suffering, that you came to it because of suffering. And certainly for me, that's exactly what that's what brought me to yoga. I think that when you're busy and you're building a career and you've got a family and you have all these things going on, I never felt like I had the time to be still, right? And I think that's such a big piece of our society, that we're all moving at 100 miles an hour, or maybe that's just me. Lots of people are moving at 100 miles an hour, but the practice of learning how to be still is so important. And so, Susanna, if somebody comes to you and they say, I'm laying in Shavasana, or I'm told to sit in yoga and like scan my body, and all I can think about are the 25 million things that I have to do today. What do you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, it's so common, right? It's ever since humans have started to meditate, our minds have wandered. Ever since humans have begun this practice, we've been distracted. And so it's not so much like that you're doing it wrong if your mind wanders. That's actually normal. It's more like, can you bring it back? Can you say whatever you choose the focus to be, whether it's like we did on the bell or a little bit on awareness of being aware, whatever you're focusing on, can you be like, oh, I'm in my laundry list, or I'm in my to-do list. Ah, hi, brain, or hi, thoughts. I see you. Welcome back, right? Gone again. Oh, welcome back. Oh, welcome back. So, and I had a teacher who said, because I remember asking this question, I was like, I'm so distracted, but then like I have these moments where, and it's totally unpredictable, where I'll just feel like complete liberation or peace or like aha or insight. Why? Like, can you help me judge my meditation and determine what I'm doing right and what I'm doing wrong? And they were like, Susanna, don't evaluate your meditation by this or that practice. Practice for 10 years, practice for, some amount of time, and then we'll see where you're at. Like there's no end. There's no beginning and there's no end. There's just wherever you are. And that was really helpful for me because it made me see that that I didn't need to be so kind of controlling of what the experience was. I could just let it be what it was. And I also do want to say, for folks who are here wondering, like, why did we meditate and why are we talking about meditation when we're talking about yoga? Yoga actually is a whole path and system, one that really was there to guide people into being able to just be with their experience, whatever their experience is. It doesn't have that much historically to do with the physical practice. That's only been in the last couple hundred years, and has 8 limbs primarily, which are like ethics, yoga ethics, ways of living in the world and being with each other, being with ourselves. Asana, which is the physical practice. Pranayama, which is breath, working with breath. So even if we can't move our body or it doesn't feel comfortable to move our body, we can work with breath. Pratyahara, which is focus. So like, for example, focusing on a candle or focusing on cooking, if you're cooking, or art or drawing or writing or reading. Dharana, which is like mindfulness of whatever you're doing. Dhyana, which is meditation, and samadhi, which is like liberation or bliss or joy. So all of that is yoga. And I really take a personal, like, I feel like it's kind of why I'm here in life, is to help us expand our understanding of what yoga is beyond just the physical, and also make sure people know, like, you don't have to do any acrobatic kind of pose. You can practice in whatever way feels like it brings sukha, ease to your experience, your mind, body, spirit.
Which is such a welcome thing for me because there's no way I can do all of the acrobatic poses. In fact, the only physical piece of yoga that I've been able to do is chair yoga because of all of the surgeries that I've had and all of that. And um, understanding that it's more than just, can you do the warrior poses, or can you hold the warrior poses for as long as, they're suggesting that you can. Certainly there are physical benefits to those kinds of things, but that there's other pieces of it. In the prelude to your book, you talk about yoga as a science of personal liberation and social justice. And you've talked a little bit about that. Would you explain a little bit more about those concepts?
Yes, absolutely. So, but I also got excited to talk about something that you said about chair yoga.
Oh, please go.
I think about, like, with warrior, and for folks who are watching, people who aren't watching, maybe you can't see, but for example, you can do warrior in a chair by moving, let me see if you can see my legs, by moving your legs to the side if you wanted, right? But say you couldn't do that and you wanted to do warrior with your legs down and just lift one foot up and put it on a block. What the beauty and the power of yoga is in the benefit of the shape in coming towards peace or power, regardless of what it looks like. So my warrior, your warrior, right? Laura's warrior, they can all look different, but what we share is the benefit of the shape, which we may find in different ways. So I wanted, and for me, that's a huge part when we're talking about yoga as a science. It's a science that takes into I believe we need to take into account the roots and kind of that organized system, but also the social justice piece is like, who is it serving? So who are the people that are in front of us? Like for me as a yoga teacher, or even me as a student, when I go to practice, I want to show up to a class where the teacher is going to teach me and my particular experience. There's a whole branch and field that's developing called accessible yoga, ACC. Actually, I don't know how to spell this correctly off. I have to look at it. I think it's ACCESSIBLE. I may have added too many S's, but accessible yoga. And the reason I bring that up is that movement is so helpful because it's like, regardless of our ability, disability status, regardless of body size or any experience, yoga is for you. Yoga is for us, and it can be accessed. So I wanted to name that first, which is where, when I'm talking about that in the beginning of the book, it's pointing at the 8 limbs that I mentioned, like that organized system that's there. But that organized system doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a context of people and how we engage with the practice. And so we have to, I believe, in a way, we get to look at all of those beautiful tools that come, vehicles for liberation that come from the tradition, and then provide people ways in the world that we're in today.
And what about the piece of social justice? You're talking about access, right? And it being something that can be accessed from all different directions and for all different people. But how is yoga a vehicle for social justice?
Yes. So the very first and the last of the 8 limbs, the first is ahimsa. In the yama, as I mentioned, the ethical practice. So ahimsa means non-harm or non-violence. And ahimsa is what Gandhi practiced when he helped overthrow the colonization of India by the British, that influenced Martin Luther King, that helped contribute to the civil rights movement, and John Lewis, who so there's so many ways that yoga itself, right at the start, is about finding sovereignty, self-rule, meaning having the freedom and the space to say, like, this makes sense for me, and I believe in this. I've taken into account and kind of gotten into conversation or had the ability to agree or disagree, but ultimately this is my truth. This is the way I'm going to live, or the way I see things. And that ahimsa is about creating that space of sovereignty for everyone, for each of us. But when we're committed to it and going deeper in a path of yoga practice, we're not just saying selfishly or self-absorbedly, this is my truth and I'm committing to my truth and I don't care about other people's. It's, oh, this thing or experience like systemic inequity is getting in the way of other people being able to express their truth. For example, if we take gender oppression, right? For women, patriarchy, or the wage gap, or the fact that, you know, we're like, speaking as a mom myself, there's assumptions like when my partner who's a man takes care of our son, it's like, oh, that's so sweet that he's taking care of your child so you can work, or that he's literally, I've heard someone say that he's babysitting. I'm like, he's not babysitting, he's the dad. So when we have these blocks to equity, freedom, full expression of ourselves, that part of a full yoga practice is working to clear away those blocks, not just for ourselves, but for others. And sometimes it takes, you know, for me, I just want to speak to, because I want to be very transparent and say, I don't have the same experience of having a cancer diagnosis. And I have had either acute or even longer, like things that have happened in my life that have had me question or had me facing death. And when those things have happened for me, there's been a way that definitely I focus inwards and I'm super focused on my own experience. And then some of the time in some of those moments, because I've experienced these things more than just once, I'm able to open to compassion and empathy for other people who have suffered perhaps the way I have, or other people who are suffering maybe in a different way than me. But that there's a way that kind of that permeability between what's me and not me softens. And that too is part of the practice of social justice, is like when the suffering happens, because it's part of nature, it's part of life. That's one of the yogic understandings, is do we use it to close and solidify around? Or are there times, are there ways, are there moments when we can soften and open and connect, and use it to connect and also to work to uplift one another?
It's so beautiful to think in terms of taking your own suffering and taking something that has been difficult for you to be able to use that as a vehicle for understanding others' suffering. And you don't have to have the same exact experience to be able to say, okay, how did I feel in that situation? Now, how does that translate into how somebody else feels? So I just think that's such a powerful idea. Thinking about the civil rights movement, and you ladies know, and other people on the call may know, that my husband is Black. And so, you know, I'm not in his skin. I don't have his experiences, but just the fact that, first of all, we love each other. I think that you're, to a certain extent, open to seeing things from another person's eyes. But I've often felt that the way that I've been treated differently as a woman, it's not the same being treated differently from a racial perspective, but being treated differently just because you walked in the room and you are who you are. There are some of those things that translate across different experiences. So I think that's such a powerful thing to remember. But then there's also a part of your book where you talk about this movement to embrace and not appropriate yoga. So will you talk a little bit more about that, especially for those of us who are white? We're not from India. We're walking into this practice saying, oh, wow, there's all these cool benefits. But how do we get the benefits and enter into yoga without taking that away from the people who brought it to us?
Yes, because in that context of social justice and in the context that we're in of yoga in the West, one of the issues that is important to care for is there are people, because of the color of their skin, because of their accent, because of who they are culturally, are actually sidelined or pushed out of being centered in yoga practice, which is not different than politics, you know, professional life. It's the same everywhere, these same systems of oppression and privilege and power. So what I was hoping to do in the book is talk about those issues in a yogic context. And yoga is specific, it's different. Living in the United States, a lot of times we have the conversation around race, particularly black, white, which is a really important conversation to have. And I very much support that conversation. And when we're talking about yoga, just the way we would be if we were talking about, say, doing sweat lodges, there, if we were talking about sweat lodges or, using sage or other indigenous practices, we should be talking about indigenous Native American folks. With yoga, which comes from India and South Asia and was codified and developed and practiced, and some people don't know this, for thousands of years, right? So it's not like just a recent thing. Indus Valley civilization, Saraswati River Valley civilization, which were organized. This is where, it's important to understand the scientific side. The civilizations that existed then, there were brick buildings. The archaeological evidence that we have is they were cities and villages that were on grids, where there were health centers with big pools at the center and what looked like, we don't know for sure, but what looked like treatment rooms, small treatment rooms around the outside. So there was a lot of advanced, there were sewage systems, a lot of advances in society. And so during that time, which about 2,500 to 3,500 years ago, long time ago, that is where yoga emerged. People, both within those villages and cities and on the outskirts, people who were engaged in lay life, householder life, working, living, but also those who said, I'm going to go to the forest and sit in a cave and practice. Both kinds of practitioners were developing this system that then they taught and passed down from teacher to student for hundreds and then thousands of years, and it comes to us. And so it's important, just the way, that we would cite, like if I was writing a paper and I was using the words of Maya Angelou, or I was using Leela Watson's words, these are different writers, thinkers, activists, I wouldn't just take their words and act like they were mine. I would cite my sources or cite the research if it was a scientific study. It's the same thing of not demoting this kind of knowledge stream or indigenous wisdom tradition to a point where we can take from it and not credit it, but elevating it to a place of, this is a source of knowledge. Yoga is actually, it's ethical philosophy. And so pointing to those knowledge systems to acknowledge and honor them. And so cultural appropriation is, at the most basic level, it's stealing, right? It's like going into someone else's place, taking their stuff and using it for your own benefit without giving them anything back or helping them. And so when we're talking about yoga, it's like, don't just take, but give respect, honor, appreciate where the practice comes from, which can be as simple as saying, at the beginning, for me, often I'll say, I'm going to share a practice that comes from South Asia, and we're going to do some meditation or some movement, and we'll see what happens, right? So it's just acknowledging the where the practice comes from, and then caring for the culture by not mocking it or harming it, which means if you're going to go in and practice a little bit deeper, maybe developing a relationship with the culture that it comes from. So for example, learning that namaste is pronounced namaste, not namaste, and to make a pun or a joke like namaste in bed, or those types of things, is actually considered offensive to people from within the tradition. And so it's sort of like what we would do if we were forming a friendship. You don't just take the parts you want from your friend. Hopefully you get to know them, their soft spots, their sensitive spots, their tender spots, and the things that bring them joy. It's the same thing with these practices. If they're not part of our own culture, to take the time and care to honor them, to respect them. And so I say that not to discourage anyone from going and practicing. I think you absolutely should go and practice yoga if it's supportive to you, if you feel like it will help you. But know that you can do it with like a curiosity and an open-mindedness and a caring.
As we talk about in the metastatic community, language matters and labels matter, and how you approach a group of people that you're not a part of, it matters, and it matters in a lot of ways. So thank you for that reminder, that we're not just going into a yoga studio for the physical benefits, but we're actually entering into a different culture, and we're actually entering into something that has been around for so long. And I think the idea of not just taking one of those 8 limbs, but looking at all 8 and how they affect you as a person, I think is very important. But let's shift to the more practical. If you were talking with someone who experienced this disconnect or this betrayal of their body and was looking to reconnect with their bodies, what would they look for? What would be, let's start first with like looking for a yoga studio or a yoga guide for somebody who comes from this experience of having some physical limitations. I like to talk about the chemo being like we've literally been pumping poison into our bodies for years. Where does somebody start if they're looking at starting to explore yoga?
Yeah. I think like a true, wonderful, supportive yoga teacher and yoga space will welcome folks wherever they're at. And so that's really important, to find a space where you feel like you can show up exhausted, where you can show up and maybe they have planned a flow class or whatever, a balancing class, and you can be there online or in person. And they say things like I tried to demonstrate in the meditation at the beginning, if you'd like to take this laying down, if you'd like to lean against the wall, where they say things like, you can take this class lying down the entirety of the class, where there's a real focus on bringing the autonomy back to that word, right? Yoga is about sovereignty. It's about autonomy back to you, that practitioner. And where the teacher is making sure that you feel in charge of your experience, and they're there to offer options and kind of guide, but always you get to be the one to determine where your practice goes. And so also that they're not using words that create a hierarchy. It's subtle, but saying things like, for the fullest experience of this pose, think of how that sounds, right? If I'm doing a practice and I'm doing it here, and they're like, for the fullest extension of this pose, send your arms out, but I can't do that. I'm going to feel like, ooh, I'm not doing the fullest. So that doesn't feel so good to me. And so I look for teachers who say one option is, another option is, without hierarchy. So teachers who cue without hierarchy, but also teachers who know enough to not just be like, everyone who can't do this, go into balasana, into child's pose, because that's not helpful either. And I will say, I've been that teacher where I wasn't really sure how to cue when someone came with a specific situation or something that they were dealing with. And I think it's our responsibility as yoga teachers, so if anyone's listening is like a yoga teacher, to get the training to learn how to give options. And so just as an example, for any shape, like for tree, which is where you stand on one foot and use the other foot to balance, to be able to guide tree on your back against a wall, holding onto a chair, or standing on the mat. And then to guide each shape guide us all into the shapes, talk about the benefit of tree, which is focus, connection to the earth, right? If I'm laying on the ground, if I'm against the wall, if I'm sitting, if I'm standing, and then bring us out together. So there's a way that we're connecting as a community, regardless of how we're each practicing. So I look for teachers who do that, which again doesn't mean our yoga teachers have to be perfect, and not putting that on teachers either. There may be times where you're like, well, that teacher really messed that up for me. I didn't enjoy that, but hopefully there's a relationship there where you can say, hey, that just totally didn't work for me. Can you research some options? So next time, I can experience that with a little more ease. Those are the first things I would look for. I'm curious if you have any thoughts.
So one thing that I always suggest to people is to set up a consultation with the yoga teacher and come to the yoga teacher and say things like what I said. I've never done this before. I think it's a little hokey. Teach me. I'm open to understanding, but I'm starting out with this bias. But also the physical limitations and why the physical limitations that I had, why they why they are something that I think yoga would help with. Cueing the teacher to, I'm going to need accommodations for X, Y, Z. Everybody in the yoga studio where I go knows that I like my spot by the wall because I can't do tree pose very well. I have a good leg and a bad leg. And so, being able to stand next to the wall so I can grab the wall and not feel like I'm going to fall over. But I just find that coming to the teacher in the beginning and just being honest about those things it is something that really helped me. So that's, not all the studios will do that. In fact, when I suggested that, the studio that I went to was very surprised. But I was just like, I have this really big story that I just need to sit down with somebody and explain, this is why I'm here. But one thing that I've experienced too in the practice of yoga and in reconnecting with a lot of those really intense feelings, whether you want to call it the betrayal of our bodies or just how there's this stuff in our cells. I mean, I think our cells remember trauma, the trauma of the diagnosis, the trauma of, I was just explaining this to my massage therapist the other day, that in the process of getting the medical care that we need, every single person who touches us hurts us. From the nurse that's jabbing us with a needle to the people who force us to lay on these really hard tables and it hurts our back, to the surgeons that are cutting us open, to the people who are pumping the chemo into our bodies. Everything hurts. And again, I think our bodies remember that at a cellular level. And so I've found in the practice of yoga that there are times when I'm just sobbing as I'm connecting to those pieces of my body that were harmed, that were affected by cancer and by the treatment, that it just is this wave of emotion. Have you worked with people, Susanna, that have had those reactions in that time of connection to their bodies?
I mean, that's so common because you're so right. And more we know now that trauma does live in our bodies, and epigenetically, even from our ancestors 7 generations back. And so that means for many of us, given the stories of our families, we likely are holding a lot from the past that may not even be ours. And so as you were talking, I was thinking about another really important quality I look for, which is a yoga teacher, a yoga space that won't spiritually bypass. So meaning that won't just bypass suffering. Like if I see a studio that has a sign, good vibes only, I just walk on by because I know, given my life experience and the level of trauma that I've experienced, even in this lifetime, let alone the past, that's not going to fly. That often in a yoga class, I cry, or one of my favorite cues, Jessamine Stanley, who's a body positive, self-proclaimed fat, Black, queer yoga teacher, who teaches online and has a place called Underbelly Yoga, I think. And so she'll say, if you need to scream, if you need to fart, if you need to sigh, it's all welcome. And that is so liberating because our bodies like they're not rational. Our minds may have like, oh, it's not polite to fart, or it's not polite to burp, or it's not okay to cry. But our bodies just, wherever they are, they're going to move that out and process it through. And we can either hold on or let it go or let it flow and come and go. So absolutely having more of that training. And in the yoga world, it's called trauma-informed yoga. So I look for spaces that are accessible, trauma-informed, and personally, I also look for culturally informed, meaning where they're not going to be like racial microaggressions. So, so I know as a person of color, I can walk into that space and hopefully that there will be care for all of these things. So trauma-informed yoga, which actually, where teachers who have trauma-informed training, they should have learned about the neuroscience of and the biology, the physical biology of stress and of trauma, and also about the efficacy, the helpfulness of yoga in addressing, not changing, right? Because, like, for example, I'm mostly blind. So I'm partially blind in one eye. I've been that way since birth. Like, nothing's going to change that. That's not something that someone can give me a bunch of yoga practices to take away or to ever alter. But my relationship to that experience can change. And so a teacher can give me practices, maybe a drishti, which is like a focus. I'm looking at my finger for those who are listening, not watching, and gazing at my fingertip and then moving it out to the side and then up and around. And so there can be practices that help, that do have benefits, regardless of the betrayals or the malfunctionings or the different, functions, however we experience it or however we conceive of it in our own lived body, mind, spirit complex. There can be practices that support us. And so I also think the best teachers and the best spaces, they don't try to fix me or you. They don't try to like pity or kind of top down tell us like what to do or that we're going to be cured or it's going to be better. But they just are like, hey, this is something that might help. Like kind of having a curious questioning and inquiry. How did that feel in your body? How did that feel in your experience? And where if I cry or if you cry, they're not jumping over with tissues and worrying, but they're just like holding the space for that experience.
Is so key. One of the yoga teachers at the yoga studio I go to spent some extra time understanding how the different yoga poses can help somebody with cancer. And one of my favorite things that I tell people is for lymphedema, the pose where you're lying on your back and you have both of your hands straight up in the air and both of your legs straight up in the air. That encourages all that fluid that gets stuck because of all the lymph nodes that we've had removed. It encourages all of that fluid to flow towards your trunk where it can then be processed better. And something as simple as that can actually relieve some of the swelling and the pain from lymphedema. And as she was explaining that, my mom, who is a physical therapist, is like, oh yeah, that makes total sense from a scientific perspective. But just remembering that there are some very simple things that you can do in your body that may really relieve some of the symptoms of in that particular situation, lymphedema, which I don't have. So I thought that was very sweet of her to research that, even though that wasn't necessarily something that was going to help me. But now every time I hear somebody with lymphedema, I'm like, oh, do this pose. That's super. I mean, it's just really simple and helpful. So I like the idea of just this holding space. They're not trying to fix. They're not trying to say, this is going to cure your cancer, because we hear that all the time from random people. But here's what might really help you as you are feeling X. My massage therapist can tell if I've been to yoga during the week because he can feel it in my hips, because the yoga helps the tightness in my hips that much. He can feel it. So just understanding what your body needs, which has taken me years to get connected enough to my body to understand what my body needs. Just that right there, it is extremely helpful.
Mm.
All right, so we've got about 8 more minutes, and I try to be very mindful of our time. Laura, are there any burning questions that you have or that you're seeing from our audience as we're talking through these things?
So, Susanna, I just have to thank you for this 50-minute literal transformation of a mindset and reframing what yoga is. I think that is so empowering and something that we can all take away from us when we have these preconceived notions of what yoga is supposed to be or look like in our mind, or how it has been appropriated in this, Western culture, et cetera, and bringing us back to that rooted history. So that's lovely. I don't have any questions at the moment, but we've gotten some even on our Facebook Live and then in the chat, people commiserating with the feeling that we do cry during these poses. So we are not alone in that. So I'm glad to clear the air that is appropriate. And in my own experience, it tends to happen after a full practice, and we'll be lying in that Shavasana, thanking our bodies for what has happened. And then the tears just come streaming. So thank you for that. Let's see, we have one question that just came through. Are there poses or practices that we should avoid as cancer patients and survivors? Is there anything, I know we talk a lot about listening to our bodies and not hurting ourselves, but is there anything in particular that we should continue to check on?
I mean, so every single one of y'all is going to be different, right? And so your body experience and what feels okay for you is really where you want to check in first. In general, for folks who are experiencing any kind of major physical trauma, which cancer treatment can register for folks, again, not assuming that it registers that way for everyone. But I would say for folks who are experiencing trauma, we want to do poses that bring ease to the nervous system rather than ramp it up. And so, for example, plank, which is a pose where you're on your hands and your feet and you're holding that, takes a lot of force, a lot of core strength, that really can get the nervous system ramped up. And so what I do often is drop my knees. And so I find another way, another option to be in that same shape. Other people around me might be holding plank all different ways. So for example, just checking in with yourself. Is this agitating me? Is this causing more stress? And sometimes I do want to acknowledge that sometimes it can feel really empowering to be like, I'm here in this shape, seated with my feet on the ground and my spine up. And I feel right now like my arms down and I feel really powerful and strong. And so that, even though it might be taking a lot of effort to do that, for you, it may register as supportive. And then at other times it may register, actually, this is causing me a lot of stress and I don't need to be here. And even though the teacher is like, power up and push through, like, I'm going to lay down right now. So I would say checking in with yourself around if those more kind of power building or heat producing shapes feel okay for you. And then the other would be any poses that put pressure on the cervical spine. So on the back of the neck. So for example, plow, where you're laying down on your back and then your legs. So if like I'm holding my palm, I'm just going to describe it because people who are listening can't see, but if your palm is like the back of your neck and then your legs are up like my hands, so kind of like a candlestick, that can put a lot of pressure and compression on the spine. And so maybe do a different shape instead, like the legs up the wall that Abigail was describing, where you can lay your body. I do this on my bed all the time because my thoughts are running at the end of the day. And to relax, I'll lay my kind of back where my pillow is and then flip my legs up against the wall and let myself just kind of rest down. And that can be a really supportive alternative to a shape that puts compression on the spine. So those are the main things, but everyone's experience will be different.
Thank you. The last question that we have as we wrap up is, we talk about accessibility as well, and especially during this time of COVID where we are not necessarily going to our yoga studios, or if we live, away from a big city or in rural areas. Do you have any recommendations for how to vet online yoga classes? I know just by Googling it onto YouTube, you can get a plethora of them. So I love this idea, Abigail, that you had about having a consultation and talking with the teacher.
Mm.
In this online world that we're living in, do you have any recommendations for how to vet?
Yes, and Heidi, I can really empathize with that experience of if you live in a more remote area, it's like, how do you find an appropriate class? There is a wonderful world now of accessible yoga. And accessible yoga, there's a book called Accessible Yoga and then a community called Accessible Yoga. And what's great is accessible yoga takes into account also the issues of race and inclusion and social justice. So it's all of it. And on accessible yoga, you can find teachers to practice with, and you can find classes online. And then the other teacher I wanted to particularly note, I didn't tell her, but I think she'll be fine with me sharing this, is so I don't actually know her website. It might just be her name, but Anjali Rao, who is a South Asian teacher. One of my actions in general is I try to uplift teachers of color, other South Asian teachers, as a way of bringing more centering to the people who created this practice. So Anjali Rao is a breast cancer survivor, and she is very passionate about bringing yoga to other survivors and other folks living with breast cancer and various cancers. And so she would be someone who I'm sure would be open to doing private consults, one-on-one classes, and she has general classes. And then the other teacher that I know would do the same is Arti Landrum. And these folks, I would say you can find them probably on Instagram, on Facebook, and on their websites that are probably eponymous, probably their names on their websites.
Susanna, I know I gave you a warning about this, but I always ask our panelists at the end of our webinars to give us a word that exemplifies or describes this conversation, this wonderful conversation that we've just had. So have you thought of that? Do you have your word that you'd like to share with us?
For me, it's connected.
Connected. I think that's a wonderful word for this discussion that we've had today. We are connected to each other as the human race, and we have so many similar experiences. And when we share those experiences with others and know that we're not alone, like we do in all of our support groups and like we do in the metastatic community, we know we're not alone. So thank you, Susanna, for coming today. For anybody who's interested in learning more about what we talked about today, this Embrace Yoga's Roots that Susanna has written is amazing. And if you look at it on Amazon, you'll see it's a #1 top bestseller in, what are the categories again, Susanna?
It's like sociology, Hinduism, which is interesting, race and equity, those types of categories. Yeah. And I wanted to mention, because I know folks may feel like, but I'm not a yoga teacher, I'm not a yoga practitioner, I don't need a whole book. If you don't want the whole book, you're more than welcome not to get it. There's also a free chapter available on my website that you'll probably link, but I can pop it in the chat too. And the reason I bring up the free chapter is it talks about trauma-informed practices that help re-regulate our nervous systems, like humming, like chanting. So that chapter, even if the whole book isn't useful, it may be useful for you.